In America, in 2026, people are arrested over hospital bills. Not for owing the money. Owing money is not a crime. For missing a court hearing about it. A debt buyer sues you. A judge orders you to appear, and if you don't show up, that same judge signs a warrant, and sheriff's deputies come to your door. You can end up in a cell over a bill you could not pay, and the company that put you there bought that bill for a fraction of what it says you owe. That is the far end of this system. Here is the near end. Her name was Edie Adams. She walked into an emergency room to report a sexual assault. The hospital ran a rape kit. Weeks later, they sent her the bill. She couldn't pay, so it was sold, for pennies, to a company most Americans have never heard of. 100 million people are carrying medical debt in this country right now, and any one of them can be sold. This is the 9th hour, and we're following one, from a mailbox, to a spreadsheet, to a jail cell, to the floor of the United States Senate. You've probably never thought about what happens after you stop paying a medical bill. Most people haven't, and that's on purpose. Here's the pipeline the hospital never explains to you. The hospital bills you. You don't pay. The hospital hands the bill to a collection agency. If that agency can't get you to pay, the hospital sells the bill outright, for pennies on the dollar, to a company called a debt buyer. The debt buyer now owns you. They can sue you. They can garnish your paycheck. They can freeze your bank account. And in most of America, if you miss the hearing they put you in, they can get a judge to issue a warrant for your arrest. The scale is bigger than almost any story you'll hear this year. 100 million Americans, 41% of all adults. That was the count in 2022, and nothing since then has made it smaller. 58% of every collections line on every credit report in the United States is a medical bill. More collections entries than credit cards, more than every other kind of debt combined. And here's the number that runs the entire industry. In 2013, the Federal Trade Commission studied 90 million individual debt accounts, worth $143 billion. They found that debt buyers pay an average of 4 cents on the dollar. None of this is an accident. The system was built, piece by piece, over 40 years. Congress abolished federal debtors' prisons in 1833. Note the word federal. The states were never told they had to follow. In 1968, Congress capped wage garnishment at 25% of your take-home pay. Politicians called it a shield. It wasn't. It was a ceiling. Permission to take a quarter of every American's paycheck forever, as long as a judge signed off. Then came the 1980s. The historian Luke Massack calls it the neoliberal ascendancy. Hospitals, which had always chased their own bills, quietly stopped. They discovered they could hand the whole problem to third-party collectors on a contingency fee. And better than that, they could sell the bills outright to buyers who paid, in Massack's words, maybe a few cents on the dollar. The hospital got some money, the buyer got the legal right to chase the full amount, and the patient, the person whose name was on the bill, was never told any of this was happening. The Fair Credit Reporting Act was supposed to keep your medical information out of lending decisions. Then, in 2005, federal banking regulators carved an exception into that ban. It let lenders consider medical information when deciding whether to give you a mortgage, a car loan, a credit card. That exception is why one bad night in an emergency room can follow your credit for 7 years.
And in 2013, the FTC published the only comprehensive study of this industry the U.S. government has ever produced. 4 cents on the dollar. 90 million accounts. $143 billion in face value. That report is now 13 years old. There has never been another one. America didn't abolish debtors' prisons. We privatized them. So who is actually buying your bill? Two of the biggest players you can look up on the stock market right now. The first is Encore Capital Group, which does business through a subsidiary called Midland Credit Management. In fiscal year 2025, Encore reported $1.4 billion in new debt purchases, $2.59 billion in collections, and $257 million in net profit. Their annual report describes the supply of American consumer debt as elevated. The second is PRA Group, $2.1 billion in cash collections in 2025, $1.2 billion in revenue. They don't pay a dividend. Every dollar goes back into the machine. These are publicly traded, SEC-regulated companies. Their entire business model is buying paper the hospital wrote off. But the biggest player in medical debt specifically wasn't Encore. It wasn't PRA. It was a company almost nobody has ever heard of, Pendrick Capital Partners. Founded in 2010, headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia, small offices, almost no press coverage. And here's the part nobody was supposed to notice. Pendrick wasn't some scrappy local firm. It was a portfolio company of Cerberus Capital Management, one of the largest private equity funds on the planet. By its own count, Pendrick handled more than 110 million healthcare accounts over 2 decades. At its peak, it managed $58 billion in medical receivables, and on its own website, Pendrick bragged that it had, quote, deployed more than $475 million to hospitals and doctors. That was the pennies on the dollar it paid them for your bills. Pendrick bought the debt. Then it placed the accounts with outside collection agencies and let them do the chasing. In one federal case, the collector Pendrick hired was a company called HOVG. Those are the names that show up on the letter. Pendrick's name did not have to appear at all. And the company operated in near total public silence until April 4, 2025. That day, the nonprofit Undo Medical Debt announced it had bought Pendrick's entire qualifying medical portfolio, $30 billion in unpaid medical bills, the debts of 20 million Americans. The debts of a country the size of Sri Lanka, sitting on one private company's servers. Undo paid $36 million for $30 billion of debt, about 1/10 of 1 cent on the dollar, and they erased all of it. 20 million Americans off the books in a single afternoon. Then, Pendrick shuddered. When KFF Health News tried to interview Pendrick's outgoing chief executive about the deal, he declined, repeatedly. Days later, on his own LinkedIn page, he called it, quote, our successful exit through an asset sale. A successful exit. 20 million erased medical debts, described by the man who ran the company as a successful exit. That's what the FTC's 4 cents on the dollar actually looks like when you follow it to a real company with a real address. And there are dozens more still operating.
To understand what happens to the people whose debt doesn't get paid back, drive 1,300 miles west from a Wall Street office to Coffeyville, Kansas. Population, 9,000. In 2019, ProPublica went to Coffeyville and found something the country still hasn't looked away from. The magistrate handling debt cases in Coffeyville is a man named David Casement. Judge Casement is a cattle rancher. He does not have a law degree. He was appointed to the bench. The collection attorney appearing in Judge Casement's courtroom is Michael Hassenplug. Hassenplug takes 1/3 of every dollar he collects for the hospitals and doctors he represents. Together, they run something the courthouse calls a debtor exam, a quarterly hearing where anyone with an unpaid medical bill has to appear and answer questions about their finances under oath. Miss the hearing for any reason, and Judge Casement issues a warrant for your arrest. In a single year in this one small Kansas town, more than 30 warrants were issued in medical debt cases. At least 11 people were jailed, some over bills as small as $230. One of those people was a man named Trez Biggs. Trez's son had leukemia. The hospital bills piled up. Trez missed the debtor exam because he was working. He was arrested. He was held on $500 bail. At intake, he was made to strip and told to brace himself for a tub of delousing liquid, because a private lawyer needed him to show up for a 15-minute hearing about a hospital bill. This is what we abolished debtors' prisons looks like in America. In 44 states, a judge can issue a warrant for your arrest, not for owing the debt. Owing is still not a crime. For missing the hearing about the debt. That's the loophole, and that's the whole game. Every viewer's next question is the same. How is any of this legal? It's legal because almost nobody fights.
In the states that bother to track it, debt collection lawsuits now make up 42% of all civil court dockets. 60 to 70% end in default judgment. The person being sued never showed up. In California, where the numbers are actually counted, consumers respond at all in about 9% of cases. Fewer than 2% ever have a lawyer. Why? Because the summons looks like junk mail. Because the hearing is at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday and you work at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. Because the last time you dealt with a government letter, something bad happened. Because you're ashamed. This isn't a lawsuit designed to be won. It's a lawsuit designed to be skipped. And every time you skip it, the debt buyer gets everything they wanted anyway. The default judgment unlocks the whole toolkit. Up to 25% of your paycheck, your bank account frozen, your credit destroyed. And in 44 states, an arrest warrant the moment you miss the follow-up hearing. The people at the top of this pipeline know exactly how the math works. And in 2025, the federal government finally tried to change it. 185 days later, the fix was dead. January 7, 2025. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau finalizes a rule. If it stands, it removes $49 billion of medical debt from the credit reports of about 15 million Americans.
April 30th, 2025. The CFPB, under new leadership, walks into court and files a joint motion with the industry that was suing it. They ask the judge to strike down the agency's own consumer protection rule. The Federal Consumer Protection Agency asked a court to strike down its own consumer protection rule. July 11th, 2025. A federal judge in East Texas, Sean Jordan, does it, vacates the rule, says the agency exceeded its authority. The rule lasted 185 days, and it never took effect for a single one of them. May 13, 2026. Senator Raphael Warnock brings a resolution to the Senate floor to restore the CFPB's medical debt collection rule, the companion protection to the one the judge had just killed. The vote is 50 to 50, a tie. And in the Senate, a tie is a loss. The motion dies on the floor. 3 Republicans cross the aisle to vote yes: Josh Hawley, Susan Collins, Bill Cassidy. One more, and it lives. 1 vote. That is the entire story of American medical debt policy in 2026. 1 vote on one afternoon in May. If Washington won't fix this, and right now Washington won't, who will? The answer, weirdly, is a debt collector. His name is Jerry Ashton, 40 years in the collections industry. In 2011, Ashton walked into Zuccotti Park, where Occupy Wall Street had set up, and thought, they don't understand debt yet, but they're about to. Within a year, Occupy activists launched the Rolling Jubilee. They used the exact same math the debt buyers used against Americans, but in reverse, buying debt for pennies and forgiving it. In 2014, Ashton co-founded a nonprofit that became Undo Medical Debt. By June 2025, they had erased $20.3 billion in medical debt for 13 million Americans. Then they did the Pendrick deal on top of that. And it isn't just nonprofits. On Last Week Tonight in 2016, John Oliver bought $14.9 million of Texas medical debt for less than $60,000 and forgave it, live on television. 9,000 Americans in one afternoon. In March 2025, the Welsh actor Michael Sheen used £100,000 of his own money to erase £1 million of debt for about 900 people in his hometown of Port Talbot, Wales. At the price Undo paid, a $2,000 bill is worth about $2.40. The same math that makes your bill nearly worthless as an asset also makes it nearly worthless as a liability. Every dollar a debt buyer collects in full is a dollar someone else could have bought for pennies and torn up. The math cuts both ways. The industry just prefers you never learn that. Which brings us back to Edie Adams. Edie didn't pay her $130.68. She pushed back. She petitioned the credit bureau directly, and it finally removed the debt from her report. She never did reach the doctor's office that billed her. By then, it had closed. Most people never do that. Most people pay, or they panic, or they don't open the envelope. And the system counts on it. So here's what to remember the next time one of those envelopes arrives in your mailbox. Open it. Ask the hospital for an itemized bill. Every line, every code. Ask if you qualify for financial assistance. Almost every nonprofit hospital in America has a policy, and almost no patient is ever told about it. And if you get sued, show up. Most of these cases are lost by default for no reason other than an empty chair. And know this, your $2,000 bill cost the person suing you pennies on the dollar, which means it is almost nothing to settle. They built a whole industry on your silence. The ninth hour is what happens when someone finally speaks.